I am not going to dispute what you just said about the United States constituting the least efficient welfare state that there is. What I will say, though, is that if this is the case, I think it's safe to assume that Kamala Harris will perpetuate that. What I ask then is, what is the alternative? Because there are clearly lots of people suffering in the United States, as evidenced by these deaths of despair. And why do you think that Donald Trump, which I assume, or who I assume you do think, will be able to remedy this, or at least move us toward a better state of being?
I'm not sure if Donald Trump can address these problems.
Okay, that's sobering.
The way I think about our domestic political choice is this. It appears, I think, to the median voter that having a rising federal debt is not a problem. In some ways, the political class has concluded that deficits don't matter and that the debt can go beyond 100% of GDP and there is no downside. And if that's right, if that's the way people think about it, then the rational thing is to vote for the candidate who's offering the largest deficit, which is clearly Trump. So Trump is effectively offering to make even more spending happen with even less taxation. So if you think that deficits don't matter and you can let the debt grow, then you might as well vote for the guy who's offering you the biggest bang fiscally for your vote. That's Trump. At some point, the bill falls due, but when? And I'm not sure I know the answer to that. I think if you'd asked me 20 years ago when I was writing book Colossus, I would have said, there's no way they get to 2024 without a real problem in the bond market. Well, here we are. What actually happened was, partly because of the global financial crisis and quantitative easing, the costs in terms of the interest on the debt went down. And so there was no cost to raising the debt, at least in the short. That means there's no pressure on either candidate to be serious about this. And that's why we're not having a discussion about the deficit, about entitlements, about any of those issues. When does reality catch up? My hypothesis is that it doesn't necessarily catch up domestically because the United States tolerates high levels of suicide and overdose and gun violence. That's part of the way American society functions. It's why Americans tolerated large numbers of deaths from COVID. Americans are in fact quite tolerant of mortality in a way that Europeans are not. I think that's because we have a risk-taking culture where there's a sort of acceptance that failure has a price. We're social Darwinists implicitly in a way that Europeans have not been since World War II. The vulnerability is not domestically. We're going to put up with this stuff. People will put up with California despite its incredible economy. They'll put up with the squalor of homelessness. They'll put up with the squalor of drug addicts on the streets. I don't know why they put up with it, but they do. The problem is the international scene. Because if your defense budget just gets squeezed and squeezed and squeezed, because it's the one thing that is easy to shrink, at some point, somebody's going to call you a bluff. And I think that's what's going to happen. American power will be challenged abroad when the defense capabilities no longer deter China. And I think that's the risk that we run in a relatively short time frame. At some point, Xi Jinping says, I'm going to do the big gamble. I'm going to blockade Taiwan. And either the US is going to fight and lose, or the US isn't even going to fight. That's his best case. At which point, I get primacy in the Pacific. And then everything changes. And this is the way I think about it. Britain's empire, in the middle of the 20th century, ran up a very large debt because we fought 2 world wars. And after a certain point, it was no longer viable for Britain to run such a large debt and such a large empire. Result, end of empire. The United States has to be steering in this kind of direction unwittingly, where if you lose Taiwan, not only do you lose dominance in the Indo-Pacific, Japanese and the South Koreans go, okay, that's it, China's number one. Also, why would the creditors of the world hold dollars and 10-year treasury bonds in the same high esteem as they did before you lost your primacy? You see, we rely heavily on foreigners still to hold a significant part of our debt. If we lose credibility as the number one superpower in the way that Britain lost its credibility in the 1940s and 50s, it's clear what happens. At the very least, the currency weakens and the cost of the debt service goes up. So that's the scenario that I think is more likely than a domestic reckoning with the super inefficient welfare state. I think we'll just carry on putting up with that. It'll be an external shock that exposes the fragility of the system.